Hello, class. Today we are going to be covering World War II. All right. And I apologize for not having it posted yet. I'll post it when I get done with the video, okay? So let me get your names down. And make sure you get your extra credit. And we will begin coverage. All right. So yeah, I normally ask if anyone had a chance to check out at least the I have a an introduction on this topic, but obviously you can't read what I don't post, right? So clearly you haven't had a chance to read it. So what I have in the intro, okay, is I'm going to share the page, is just war doctrine, right? So I've just read the basics of this, okay? I don't pretend to be extremely knowledgeable on the topic, but I find it fascinating enough to organize my discourse on this assignment around this topic, beginning at least as early as St. Augustine of Hippo, and he was what, the 300s or 400s AD. People would write on behalf of the Catholic Church when the Catholic Church had a monopoly over Christianity, right, in its first opening centuries. They began making laws and writing concerning the proper parameters of war, right? The boundary lines and the do's and don'ts and normative behavior, even during something as violent as war. So it kind of just evolved, right? They took the writings of people like Augustine and a person who supposedly kind of synthesized, like put a lot of it together, is Hugo Grotius during the early modern era, like the 1600s. He was a Dutch humanist, and he, like I said, he put a lot of it together in synthesized form. All right. So the two categories that he puts it in with just war doctrine, right, are the reasons for which you fight and the manner by which you fight. So hence, right, if you fight for the right reasons as a nation or kingdom, if you fight in the right manner during the war, then you can, according to the or in conjunction with the tenets of Christianity, you could fight as a soldier with a clear conscience. All right, because remember, this is an interesting topic within Christianity, Catholic or Protestant, right? That Jesus said at least at the micro level, on the individual level, right? As just a citizen living within, a country, that if someone strikes you in one cheek, turn and offer the other cheek, right, to him and let him strike that one as well. Jesus told Peter, right, to put down his sword when Peter attacked and cut a guy's ear off in the gospel accounts. And he said, those who live by the sword die by the sword, right? But then you have other, because remember, I went to a Catholic college, so I got to read up on a lot of this stuff. You also have verses like in, oh gosh, it's been too long. But I want to say Romans as well as Thessalonians, where you have verses where it states that the state is there, and it's pretty much saying, right, that a lot of people working the state will very well not be Christians. But even though they don't believe in the Judeo-Christian God, unbeknownst to them, they are being used by the Judeo-Christian God to maintain law and order and to execute God's justice. And so that's where some Christians, right, have stated that it's contextual, that at the micro level, Jesus made it clear that Christians of any denomination are not to engage in violence, even if someone were to engage in violence against them. But at the macro level of the state and having a police force and having armed forces, that verses as found in Thessalonians and in Romans can apply, and it's not a contradiction, but that it's a completely different context. That if fighting under the state, you have the power to inflict violent, quote, justice on others under the right circumstances. So at any rate, and then of course you have some, and that has not been resolved to this day, right? You still have some Protestant and Catholic Christians who are pacifists. You know, I think of the Quakers, right? And saying that it is against their religion, it's against their view of Christianity to serve as soldiers and to fight and kill someone, even if it's organized under an official war. So when you go with this one, right, we're not going with that latter group. We're going with the former group that contends that context is everything, and that the Bible sanctions organized state sanctioned violent participation in war, as long as Hugo Grotius categorized it, they are fighting for the right reasons and they're fighting in the right manner. Okay. So for the right reasons, right? The right reasons, a lot of it, from what I've understood and read, falls under the old code of chivalry, right? That under the chivalric code of the medieval time period, etc., noblesse oblige, as it was called, right? The nobleman's obligation is that if there is a bully getting the better and just bullying a weaker party that cannot protect itself, that it is your Christian duty to protect that weaker party from the bully. All right. And then, as with many worldviews, within the first category of the reasons for which you fight, it also can be included not only chivalry, fighting for a weaker party against a bully, but also out of self-preservation. So if someone were to actually invade you, okay? So those are the extreme ones, or just the most salient. They stood out the most from what I've read on just war doctrine under those two kind of categories, okay? And then you have, right? I think in there also you have, which is a lot less fun, for lack of a better adjective, to enumerate, is the unremunerated confiscation of property. When one party usurps, illegally takes, right, property from a weaker party and refuses to compensate them, remunerate them, then a redress of that imbalance ought to be made. Okay. So then moving on to the second category. All right. Like I said, I'm being broad here, not to be condescending to you, but for one, not to be online forever this afternoon, and two, because I'm limited in what I've read on this stuff. All right. Secondly, with the manner by which you fight a war, the most salient, again, that stood out the most facet of this category that I've read is is discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, right? A lot of this should sound familiar, you guys, because we've kind of codified a lot of these just war doctrine components into the Geneva Accords, into the UN, etc. to this day. But so hence, right, if you are fighting in a battle, you are to have a confined area that would be, lined out as your battlefield. And you should fight other combatants who are armed, prepared, have been organized and trained to fight you, and are wearing uniforms, right? And you are to contend against one another. But you are not to go into a village and attack, unarmed civilians that are just trying to live their daily lives in their homes, etc. And so hence the, discriminating combatants and non-combatants really stood out the most to me in that second category, reading about Hugo Grotius and his syntheses of this doctrine. And then also what I found really standing out was proportionality, right? And so hence, if there is an attack, if you have, I can't remember how much we have. I want to say we got to be, are we getting close to 400 million in this country? I know we're over 300, but at any rate, you have a country of over 300 million people, and Pancho Villa went across the border and attacked Columbus, New Mexico. And in the process, he killed 21 civilians. All right. Well, the doctrine of proportionality would state that, okay, keep things in proportion as far as your just recompense of their act. Don't drop an atom bomb on Mexico City that would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians just in retaliation of Pancho Villa's attack across the border to Columbus, New Mexico, killing 21 Americans. So that sense of proportionality, right, has been enumerated by many people who have written about just war doctrine. And remember, this is all theoretical. I've had students when I've gone over in class, right, where you could have more kind of interaction. I've had veteran soldier students kind of scoff at that latest one and say that proportionality is not realistic as a measure, as a measuring line to try to attain during an actual gritty war. But they have it there nevertheless. Okay. So at any rate, that's what I have in the intro. All right. And so what I'm setting up, as you could easily guess, is to what extent do you believe subjectively that World War II was a just war for the United States? Because, when people try to use terms like evil, right, which if you're not operating from the same, Judeo-Christian worldview, let's say you're agnostic or atheist, you may not believe necessarily in inherent evil, but yet nevertheless, even in a secular society, oftentimes people will at least be willing to address the possibility of that classification of the Holocaust, right? Of Nazi Germany's, quote, extermination of 6 million Jews living in Europe. And by the way, that was 2/3 of the Jews living in Europe. They wiped out systematically, right? The concentration camps and with their Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen was their cleanup crew, and they came behind their battle lines. The SS leaders and Hitler and others would make a decision as to what nationalities and what ethnicities in different regions of Europe constituted an inferior race and did not live up to their notion of the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. And if they did not, the final solution, right, the euphemism they used for that term, was to have them killed, to have them systematically murdered. And so the Einsatzgruppen would come behind lines and kill, just in large numbers, civilians, regular non-combatants in these countries that they were invading. All right. Or have them sent to numerous concentration camps. And of course, you're probably familiar, Auschwitz is probably arguably the most notorious. All right. Where they killed so many. So at any rate, when you look at that, And when you look at some of the depredations committed by the Japanese soldiers during World War II, it just oftentimes, right, if someone wants to even try to approximate that argument that we had a just war in which we truly were fighting for a cause that was worthwhile and that was just, right? A lot of people historically would say World War II above all the other wars that we fought. And of course, I'm talking about foreign wars, because of course, in tight competition with World War II would be the Civil War, obviously, because it involved the liberation, the emancipation of slaves. Okay. So at any rate, with number one, what I'm saying is this is court history, is I'm making the argument you see here in red. Because fascism virtually represents, practices, and extols or praises all that which is seen as abominable since the Enlightenment, and because such fascist countries sought to forcefully dominate the world and impose such a dangerous political system on all conquered nations, the U.S. and her eventual allies of Britain and France had to fight righteously against this evil onslaught. So this is court history, right? This is praising our country. It's declaring we were the good guys. And notice the categories, right? The two categories. We're dealing with the first category, aren't we? The reasons for which you fight. And we're saying the reason for which we fought World War II was just, because fascism in and of itself was inimical. It was dangerous and harmful to what we hold dear in modern Western civilization. All right. So, for instance, right, with fascism, they held on to Nietzsche's writings. Adolf Hitler went to a monument dedicated to Nietzsche, because I believe Nietzsche had died. Nietzsche died pretty young. But remember, we talked about this with Dangerous Ideas for Overseas Imperialism, how Nietzsche had thought that society was becoming too decadent and too soft, too civilized, and now how it needed to go back to its barbaric militaristic roots. Well, they supposedly, with fascism, a lot of it was drawn to that. And so they had no problem utilizing violence as a political instrument. So that right away ought to be disconcerting to people in Western civilization, modern Western civilization. So, for instance, they had the brown shirts. They were modeled after the first fascist country, Italy, right? And Benito Mussolini's black shirts. They would take to the streets and they would brutally fight and use knives and guns, etc., and literally murder leftist opponents out on the streets, like in gang fights and like these mini battles, these urban battles. Okay. They also employed eventually the threat of force upon those who challenged their policy. The Gestapo, right? The Gestapo were the daily instruments of fear that could come knocking on your door and have you arrested for the smallest infraction of conformity that they demanded, for any type of opposition, for hiding any Jews or any other undesirables, etc. And of course, ultimately, they became so heavy-handed by the middle of the war that they would just pull people out of their homes and shoot them in the head right on the street for everybody in the neighborhood to see. It became that just blatantly transparent. And then, of course, their foreign policy. They contended that it was kind of like Manifest Destiny that we had in the 1840s, that it was destined, right? That it was predestined for a third empire to arise in Germany, a third Reich, right? But that this third Reich was destined not only to rise, but to rule the world. All right, to rule the world. And so one euphemism that they used that you might be familiar with is Lebensraum. And Lebensraum is translated, I'm sorry, I got the hiccups. I apologize. Is translated as living space. All right. And of course, they're going to ultimately contend that they're going to use that term in connection, in particular, to Russia. All right, as living space for their people to live in. All right. So they were imperialistic. They wanted to take over as many countries as possible and impose their fascist government political system on them. All right. Another part of fascism, besides sanctioning violence that was dangerous to Western civilization, was their demand for conformity. Remember, the fasces, that they get the term fascism from, it is a bundle of straw that is tied up into a bundle together, and it just simply, connotes the contention that individually we are as weak as straw, but bound together into a bundle, we're unbreakable. Okay, so hence the term fascism. So hence, right, they would coerce, they would compel conformity. You had to be at one with fascist policy of the German National Socialists known as the Nazi Party. All right. So there was no permission of an independent press to speak ill of them, to write any type of criticism of their policies. They would not tolerate that. And again, their whole sanctioning of violence, you were lucky if you were only arrested, right? You could ultimately be thrown into a concentration camp and or killed. Okay. There were no alternative political parties, because it was a multi-party system under the republic before them, and that they put an end to. And they outlawed all other political parties. Okay. There was no just freedom of expression, because remember, they killed 6 million Jews, but they also killed 6 million more undesirables. They killed 12 million people systematically in the Holocaust. These other undesirables were homosexuals, Christians, Jehovah's Witnesses, the mentally and physically disabled, and the list goes on of people that the homeless, etc. So if you didn't fit into their people's community, their Volksgemeinschaft, you were in trouble. So conformity was everything, and there was no freedom of expression. And remember, in the early 1800s, we'd experienced classical liberalism, right? Where we stated, remember, your freedom to swing your fist ends only where my nose begins. You can do whatever you want until it infringes on someone else's rights, right? And that classical liberalism was very popularly embraced here in the U.S., in England, etc. And this goes diametrically opposed to that, where they demand conformity. You cannot be yourself and be individualistic, etc. Then in addition to that, right, well, who determines fascist policy? Well, with them, right, they ascribed like almost supernatural, like I'm not exaggerating, like almost divine characteristics to their Führer, to their leader, right? Adolf Hitler. He was supposed to almost mystically, almost religiously, and we're not talking about anything to do with Christianity, could discern what the destiny was for the Third Reich, for this Third Empire of Germany, of the Nazi Party. So it was blind allegiance to autocratic rule, to rule by a single person dictator. This is going to hurt them when it comes to military history, because the last, like, the buck, stopped with Hitler. He made all the ultimate decisions on military maneuvers, tactics, strategies, etc. All right, because he was the Führer. He was their leader. So hence, this blind allegiance to one man, okay? Go back to the War for Independence, right? And all of our pamphlets and our propaganda against King George III, and how we did not want autocratic rule by a man of any sort. And of course, that was tied to the French Enlightenment. That was tied to the Scottish Enlightenment, of not trusting any man with too much power. But the fascist countries did. All right. And then, like I said before, the fact that these fascist countries were going to forcefully impose this type of society on other innocent nations is enough, according to the writer of Number One, to contend that America had just reason for fighting in World War II, to combat the spread of this fascist ideology that is clearly inimical or dangerous to what modern civilization in the West holds dearly. All right. Are there any questions? Okay. Remember this also, as far as looking like the bad guys. The end of World War I. You have the Treaty of Versailles, right? Article 10 it infuriated the German people. All right. Because what it stated was, right, is that only the losing sides had to let go of their international empires and give self-determination to the peoples that they had taken over. So Germany had Somaliland, Zanzibar in Africa. They had some places in Asia. They had taken land from France, like Alsace and Lorraine. They had taken land from Holstein and Denmark, and that land was given back to them. They had taken all of modern-day Poland, and they gave it back to a new Polish country. So with all being said, over 10% of German land was taken from them at the end of World War I in the name of self-determination of the peoples, right? That it was a very simple idea of Woodrow Wilson and others, is that, right, that these were different ethnic groups. They were different nations of people who had their own sovereign history, and they deserve to elect their own leaders and have their own separate governments. But Article 10 stated that the winning side didn't have to apply that principle. The winning side, hypocritically, could keep their lands, their territories that they had acquired, right? So France had Morocco and other areas in northern Africa, right? They had French Indochina or Vietnam. They had islands in the Caribbean. They held on to them. England had India, right? South Africa. etc. They held on Egypt. They held on to those things, right? And so that infuriated the German people. And then you had, I always forget if it's Article 231 or 251, but it's known as the War Guilt Clause. If you look it up, it'll tell you which number it is. It's one of those two, I'm pretty sure. But known as the War Guilt Clause, it contended that Germany was responsible for World War I and hence had to pay for the cost of the war to the Allies, known as reparations. And they knew the number would be so high, right, that they couldn't or even refused to immediately set an exact number of how much in Deutschmarks the Germans had to pay to the Allies. So they kept it open-ended, okay? So at any rate, Hitler, part of his platform in Rising, right, was to capitalize on sentiment in Germany against this unfair Versailles Treaty. And then also, which seems to be unfair, is the two military leaders of Germany at the end of World War I were Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg. And they were not about to sign an embarrassing peace treaty to the Allies, right? Admitting loss for obvious reasons. Their historical image for future generations to come. Any political plans and ambitions that they had would be ruined. So they did not want to be tainted with this treaty. So they demanded the formation of a new republic. And it was established at Weimar, Weimar. And Weimar happened to have a larger segment, a larger enclave of Jewish Germans than many other cities in Germany. So when they were elected, there was a decent number of Jewish Germans that were elected into this parliament. And they were told, by the way, they had no choice but to sign this embarrassing treaty, lest the Allies continue the war and brutally burn Berlin to the ground. So they signed it, right? And I think you know where this is going. Hitler contended that the Weimar Jews stabbed the German people in the back by signing this unpatriotic, this treasonous treaty with Germany's enemies. All right. So in 1933, 32 or 33, the Germans ran in parliament, and they got not a majority, but a plurality, the most votes into the parliament of any other political party. It was above 30% voted for the German National Socialists, the Nazis. So at that time, the leader, who was Paul von Hindenburg, gives the prime minister or chancellor position to one of the Nazis, and he knew their clear leader was Adolf Hitler. So he gives it to Adolf Hitler. So Hitler became, and you could say that there was a bit of a popular sanction, a popular approval, right? A popular vote that gave Hitler the position of prime minister. Well, Paul von Hindenburg dies, supposedly of natural causes, and the Reichstag, the parliament building, gets burnt to the ground. Adolf Hitler blames the Communist Party for burning it to the ground, starts a witch hunt as the prime minister against the communists and those leftist parties, socialists, etc. Okay. And declares a state of emergency under what was called in English the Enabling Act. and declares himself the emergency dictator of Germany. And of course, he never relinquished that title until the end of World War II. Like Rome, it was supposed to last for only about 6 months, but he never let go of it. And from there on, he was declared the Führer, generically the leader of Germany. And there went their republic, like our government, elected reps, etc., checks and balances, and all that. So what he does, right, like some tyrants have done, is they'll justify what they're doing, right, by contending that it's what all of his people want. And so he starts resisting or defying the Allied powers in regard to the terms of the Versailles Treaty. So one of the first things he does is he stops paying reparations to the Allied powers. Says that Germany was too poor, because remember, they had a depression like others, and that they couldn't afford it, and that it was unjust, that they weren't responsible for the war, World War I, and so they weren't going to pay anymore. Then secondly, they were supposed to be limited to 100,000-man army to not pose so much of a threat to France in particular, next to them. Well, he defied that. And in fact, what he did, he was a little bit subtle about it. He would draft and train about 100,000 German young boys, and then release them, and then draft 100,000 more, and so on. Okay, so until it got into the millions. I think at their peak, they had at least a 8 million man army, but at any rate, he defied that sanction of it. Then he states, right, that he needed the port of Danzig for his navy and for trade from Poland that had been separated from Germany. So he sent soldiers there, and he took Danzig. Then there was the Rhineland, and the Rhineland was rich in coal, and the Allies had put an international army in the Rhineland, northwestern part of Germany, next to France, to make sure that no invasion army would invade France again, but also to be able to extract that coal as their just reparation. Okay, well, he sent his army to the Rhineland to challenge the international soldiers that were on German soil in the Rhineland, and they kind of played a game of chicken, and the international soldiers blinked first, and they evacuated and went back into French territory. All right. Then he contended that he wanted a portion of a new country that was carved out of Germany, known as Czechoslovakia, right, or the Czech Republic. And it was called the Sudetenland. And he contended that there were a lot of Germans living there who had moved there, and that was considered to him German territory. So he forcefully took the Sudetenland from the Czech country. All right. By this time, he's getting warned by the English and French leaders, okay, slow your roll. All right. We admit that our predecessors before us perhaps were too harsh on your country at Versailles, but you're going over the line, right? Well, he goes a step further. Well, actually, before he went a step further, Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain made a pact with him and said you could have these lands, right? And you could refuse to pay reparations, but no more land after this. He said that Hitler was appeased, right? And when you're appeased, right, you were once angry over something, and then you were granted something that gave you a sense of satisfaction that took your anger away. So he said, Hitler has been appeased, right? And that there will be peace in our time. were his famous quotes. Well, right after this, Hitler broke his word. He lied. He took all of Czechoslovakia. In addition to that, he sent his troops into Austria. Remember, he was himself born Austrian, and the Austrians were German cousins, Germanic speaking, German culture, etc. But they were still a separate empire, right? The Austria-Hungary, etc. during World War I. He called it the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria. And of course, he contended that the Austrians wanted him to, because they accepted him, an Austrian, rule in Germany and Germany as their own. And then, as if I didn't mention already, they took all of Czechoslovakia. So now Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. And then finally, they gave an ultimatum to him, saying, if you take one more scrap of land, we are going to intervene militarily. It's going to mean war. Okay. And as you probably know, he contended that Poland never had a reason in modern day history to exist, that for a long time it had been controlled by Germany. And so on September 1st, 1939, his army invaded Poland. And that started World War II. All right. Then with the case with Japan. Japan had a series of assassinations in 1936. Okay. You know, it began arguably around 1905 with the Meiji Restoration of Japan, whereby they contended, right? The very, very curious combination to me in Japan is a revival of the old traditional Japanese samurai culture, okay, Bushido, but yet embracing new technology, new institutions, etc. So it was almost kind of an oxymoron. It was like new modern appropriations for a regressive, going back to the golden age goal. All right. So they sent their military advisors and their educational advisors to the United States, as well as to Germany. They sent, I can't remember what the other ones were, to France, what areas it was in, but it's the beginning of Japan, the Meiji Restoration, of their reputation for appropriating things from other countries and then twisting them into their own usefulness and succeeding very well with it. Okay. And so they did that beginning in 1905. And they started building a modern military, etc. Remember, they had a brief war with Russia over Manchuria, and they beat Russia. And that got a lot of people's attention, that this, quote, you know, like, wow, a, quote, Asian country defeated a European country. All right. But then, like I said, you had, by 1936, you had a young group of fascists who wanted a lot of things that were compatible with the institutions of Nazi Germany. They wanted a single ruler. They wanted to do away with the Diet. The Diet was their parliament. They wanted a one-party rule, and they wanted to liberate Asian countries and lands from European imperialist powers, right? So it was translated as a pan-specific Asia for the Asians movement, that they were supposed to be liberating their fellow Asian countries from European rule. Well, those who spoke against them in the Diet, including the prime minister, um, were violently attacked. And I don't know if they succeeded with the prime minister. I can't remember if they killed him or not, but they killed quite a few in a single purge of 1936 of those who were against their plans and ambitions. And so clearly Japan was ceasing to become a republic, again, like ours. Well, in their case, they had two leaders, right? They had their somewhat aloof, spiritual, traditional leader in the form of Emperor Hirohito. And then they had their military party leader, right? Hideki Tojo, who really was day to day and with military decisions and all that, calling the shots. Tojo was. So they came into Manchuria, and several European powers demanded that they remove themselves and their soldiers, and they refused. Okay. They had a Mukden incident, Mukden, in which they were not supposed to be there, according to international community, and a railroad blew up. And a lot of people to this day believe the Japanese themselves staged it and had it happen. And the railroad station, you had a series of explosions, and they blamed it on the Chinese. And from there, they began a full-blown invasion of China. Right? Then the press got involved, and especially at a place called Nanking, or sometimes it's spelled like Nanjing. And you just Google the rape of Nanking, and you'll see piles of dead bodies, piles of skeletal bones, Chinese people being tied up to posts and being used as bayonet practice, and then the Japanese soldiers stabbing them for practice. Just horrific violations of human rights at Nanking and other places, okay, in China and elsewhere later. So at any rate, Franklin Roosevelt in the US, he made it clear, by the way, he wanted to get involved in this war long before the country did. And to him, it was very simple, similar to what Woodrow Wilson claimed, is he contended that it was essential for humanity that the Allies win, and that the Allies very well will or do need our help to win. We need to help the good side to win, FDR thought. So when the Japanese were doing this, right, he was already leaning against them as a fascist ally, right, making their Axis alliance with Italy and Germany. So at any rate, he issues a moral embargo because Japan was very short on scrap metal for her military, particularly for like jet planes, etc., and oil, right? So he contends, he gave them a timeline, Japan, and said, you have a certain amount of time to pull out of China, or else we're going to withhold trade in scrap metal and in oil to your country. All right. And that, to almost anyone's interpretation, is tied to the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, right? Their attack on us in the Hawaiian Islands, which formally got us involved in World War II. So you could see, right, with like number one, how people would see the fascist countries as inherently, right, just in and of themselves, um, a threat to Western civilization. That's a crazy photo shot right there. Like literally, those guys in that split second are being killed, shot in the back of the head by the Einsatzgruppen. The guy next to them in the bottom right is Joseph Mengele. He was that terrible doctor at Auschwitz who performed experiments on Jewish children that involved torturous and murderous methods. Up above it, that's a Nuremberg rally. Remember, at Nuremberg also, they would issue their Nuremberg laws, and that's the beginning of all of it domestically, whereby they would declare who was a member, who qualified for a member of the people's community, who qualified as a Jew, who qualified as another type of undesirable, what the punishments were, etc. The Nuremberg laws. And then there to the left, you see Adolf Hitler next to Benito Mussolini of Italy. So if number one deals with the first category of the reason for which we fought was just, right? Number two says the manner by which our enemies fought was unjust, and therefore this was a just war. So number one deals with category one, number two deals with category two of how war is fought. And in a nutshell, you guys, it was the simple concept of discrimination. The Japanese quite often did not discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Because remember, according to international law by this time, if you surrender, you are no longer declared a combatant. And you're not to be treated as such. So POW, as you probably know, is a prisoner of war. As you read number two, you'll find that the Japanese dealt horrifically with prisoners of war. Look it up there in red. To compare the fates of American prisoners held in the two major theaters of war from 41 to 45, nearly 40% of U.S. military prisoners in Japanese captivity, while just over 1% of American POWs died in Nazi hands. 9 out of 10 prisoners who died in World War II perished while in Japanese custody. That's an incredible stat. Okay. So I want you to read for yourself. I want to leave some to be, some mystery here. I'd like you guys to find out for yourselves in reading number two, okay? No matter which one you choose, please make sure you read them all. But you'll find several cases of them not abiding by that concept of how they treat non-combatants, namely prisoners of war. And I will say one thing is another thing that could add to court history is quite a few countries, Asian countries, that we ended up liberating in winning this war from Japanese, rule. There's a lot of video coverage and written coverage of the people being ecstatic, being extremely happy, and sensing that we did truly liberate them from the Japanese. Despite their rhetoric, right, of Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, that all the Asians are supposed to prosper together, that they were liberating fellow Asians from Europeans, their treatment of other Asians, like I mentioned at Nanking in China, and another one that I've read in a book were the Filipinos. When the Japanese took over the Philippines, they did some awful, brutal things to the Filipino people. All right. Now I'm pretty predictable here, right? I think you won't be surprised that I do a bit of a 180 here. And then I contend, well, the manner by which we fought the war was not necessarily just either. So this is revisionist history. Okay. So for one, combatants versus non-combatants. Now, I don't know of us having a horrible record in our treatment of prisoners of war, but namely our aerial bombing, right, from the air, from jets, a lot of times from the B bombers, right, the B-52s, etc. Our bombing of cities and certain urban targets knowingly killed thousands of civilians in these Axis countries. So if you wanted to look up, right, more on this, you could look up our incendiary bombs in Japan. We dropped bombs that deliberately created fires on the buildings in the areas of the cities in which we dropped them, especially in areas where we knew that the buildings were primarily still made of wood and were flammable. Another city that was a gorgeous, supposedly gorgeous medieval city in Germany was Dresden, Dresden. And you could look up how badly we destroyed that entire city and how many civilians we killed in the process of our bombing raids of Dresden, Germany. Now, in fairness, at the beginning of the war, the British Prime Minister, right, the Bulldog, I can't believe his name is eluding me. Anybody help me here? The British Bulldog himself, Prime Minister, oh my goodness. It'll come to me here pretty soon, hopefully. But at any rate, he was quite a guy. He was the one that claimed that Hitler was a threat to the world long before Hitler came out as the dictator of Germany, etc. He could kind of say that he called it before most of the world did. Okay, this new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Okay. He was a bit cantankerous in his private life. There was a funny quote where in his grumpiness at some social function, a woman told him, Mr. Churchill, if I were your wife, I would put poison in your coffee. And he said, Madam, if you were my wife, I would gladly drink it. And he was just that type of guy. But at any rate, he was just kind of jaded, and he, during the Blitz, right? When Germany was thinking about having a land invasion of the island of England and Scotland, they were trying to soften that landing up, which never came, by the way, by aerial bombings. And they bombed the city of London and other major cities indiscriminately. And they killed thousands of English civilians. So Churchill was not in the mood to talk just war doctrine concerning bombing of cities of Germany, right? He said, hey, they did it first, which was technically true. He says, so I have no qualms with doing it right back. Okay. Supposedly, our commanders, coming from the president, said, we have a problem with that morally. Can we at least have some type of compromise? What we devised was a point system. All right. So, for instance, munitions factories that are literally developing, weaponry might be worth like 5 points. Communications would be worth 2 or 3 points. Okay, etc. And I can't remember what the number was supposed to be. It was pretty low. It might have been as low as 5. But if a city merited at least 5 points, etc., on this criteria, then we would be okay with bombing that city, right? Because it was connected to the war effort, these munitions factories, etc. So it made sense to justify such. Well, so at any rate, we did that for the most part. But still, let's say munitions factories. You look here in the U.S., look at our Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, Oakland, right? And in the East Bay area here of California. Imagine if the Japanese or the Germans had bombed those cities and said, hey, those are worth 5 points. There are munitions factories there. And, killed all the workers, the inhabitants in the local neighborhoods, etc. We would have been just absolutely, flabbergasted and indignant. But we did that to them. And we killed thousands of people that were working in the factories, living in homes nearby the factories, etc. But then it got worse. Is that with one case, which was Romania, they had a leader who switched their initial neutrality to siding with the Axis powers, the fascist countries, right? The bad guys. And Churchill convinced our military leaders and political ones that if we were to simply bomb the capital of Romania and cause some havoc there, that the people in Romania would rise up against this unpopular ruler and get him to change his alliance with the Axis powers. Well, we did. Okay, and there were no points that I know of, that I've read of, as far as munition factories, nothing in this Romanian capital. But we hit it nevertheless, and it did, however, have that intended effect of getting Romania to revoke its alliance with the Axis powers. And then, perhaps most controversially, along that same pattern, was Hiroshima, right? I'm not sure about Nagasaki, the second one we hit. But Hiroshima, when we hit that place, it did not merit enough points to justify hitting that city. There were no munition factories, no major contingents of troops, no telecommunications, etc. Right? It didn't merit it on our little, system, our little criteria. But also, that city was arguably pristine. They have moving footage of people walking up and down the streets of Hiroshima days before the bomb dropping of August 6th of 45. And the city was beautiful, bustling with people, plenty of businesses, activities, etc. And no buildings seem to have been hit by bombs, etc. Like war hadn't touched that city. Well, to some people, they believe that was precisely the reason for which we dropped our first atomic bomb on that city. Is we wanted everyone to know that no, it did not look destroyed because it had been destroyed before by traditional bombing. That this place, we want them to be able to do a contrast of before and after and really see the destructive capacity of this hydrogen bomb. So that's what we did. And we only waited 3 days to hit Nagasaki with what was it, plutonium, even stronger, like a plutonium atomic bomb. And by the way, the Japanese civilian government were clearly making overtures for peace before August of 45. But the military and Tojo were not. So our excuse was, it doesn't matter how much the civilian leaders of Japan want peace. That matters nothing because the military is the institution that's in control. And they are, quote, fanatical. According to the Bushido code of the samurai, it is death before dishonor. And they will not surrender unless something drastic is done to break their will and to frighten them. That's what the new president Truman and his administration argued. Then what they also argued is they looked at the worst fought islands that we engaged in with the island hopping campaign, right? Moving closer and closer to the Japanese main islands. For instance, you could look up a little island called Peleliu, Peleliu, I think. Another one is Tarawa, Tarawa. And then, of course, more famous or infamous is Iwo Jima and also Saipan, Saipan. When you look there, right, there were tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers put onto these little islands that we claimed were imperative to win so that we could use such islands, build tarmacs, right, for airplanes, for fighter planes to fly from toward Japan itself as we got closer and closer. So when you look at these islands, they would put, in almost every case, the one I mentioned, well over 10,000 soldiers, and oftentimes have fewer than 10 prisoners of war taken, because they were told and even threatened to fight to the death and never surrender. And they did stats on how much American blood it was costing to gain each foot of land in these islands. And it was costly. It really was. So Truman is going to use that data and contend again that the Japanese military leaders were so fanatical that scaring them with a new high-powered weapon was necessary. But that also, right, that a home invasion was the only other alternative to dropping these nasty bombs of the main Japanese islands, and that a home invasion, look at about how costly it was just to take those little aforementioned islands, would have been much even worse. So he said, I would rather kill Japanese civilians as a lesser evil with these new nasty weapons than I would killing American soldiers in a land invasion. And of course, to some critics, right, they contend that that is a false dilemma, whereby you act like, oh, it's either A or B. And you're like, no, there actually are options C, D, E, F, etc. So, for instance, some people said we could have put the Japanese islands into a military blockade and starved them into submission. That's another common critique of President Truman's rationale. And then also, what's interesting, putting together the Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico, right? They called it Project Manhattan or Manhattan Project. You have Robert Oppenheimer, who's put in charge. Okay. And a lot of these other scientists that either came there and worked with him or who refused on principle to come to New Mexico and be paid by the US government, but were willing to be contacted and give like advice, scientific help to Oppenheimer. All right. One of them I think is Niels Bohr, a Danish scientist, Bohr. Niels Bohr supposedly knew more than Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer was constantly like trying to call him and get in touch with him to get advice as to this new weaponry of splitting the atom as a weapon. But why didn't Niels Bohr come? Why didn't several others? Well, a lot of them had moral qualms, right? For at least two reasons. Is one, a lot of them were intellectuals, right? They were scientists and professors, etc. And they didn't like the idea of their contribution to world history using their brains to create a destructive weapon that would kill tens of thousands. I think with Nagasaki, it got up to over 100,000 people, right? Not only the idea of violence and destruction as the end or goal, or right, of their scientific inquiries, some had qualms with, but others, right, had a very healthy jealousy, right, fearful of losing what they had, a healthy jealousy and distrust of government, period, including the American government, that they felt like academia needs to stay together and stay separate from governments and not become the henchmen, right? The hired hands of government bureaucrats. And so for at least those two reasons, some had qualms about using their brains for this end. And by the way, a third thing that eventually materialized as a form of opposition was that the quite a few of these gentlemen were fleeing Nazi Germany back in Europe. They had loved ones who were getting killed or chased out by. Some of these gentlemen were Jewish. And so hence, right, they made it clear our propaganda was stating that the Nazis were racing for a nuclear weaponry and that we had to beat them. So in our propaganda, it was almost always about a race with Nazi Germany. And so to a lot of these immigrants from Europe, that made sense. That hit home. right? They considered Nazi Germany their enemy. But then when we defeated Nazi Germany by April of 45, and now going into the summer, all we have to fight with and use these weapons against are the Japanese. Some of them had a problem with that and said, wait a minute, the Japanese aren't engaging in a Holocaust like Nazi Germany is. We didn't intend these weapons for them. So those were at least three qualms that these intellectuals had, right, tied to the Manhattan Project. Well, Oppenheimer, I think I'll use what I was about to say for later on the Cold War, but there's more drama that we'll add to it later. All right. And then another thing that we did, a couple other things, is one, we cracked the codes. We didn't actually. It was the Europeans. The Poles helped the English crack the Enigma code, right, back in Europe. And so they knew the code used by the Germans on the airwaves and through Morse code, etc. We knew what each code word meant, etc. So we knew what the Germans were going to do before they do it. They did it. You had a Bletchley Park in England. That was the center of this. The English shared it with us. All right. And then we had Operation Code Magic, and we deciphered the Japanese code as well. So when we were fighting, particularly the Japanese, and we kept seeming to anticipate their every move because of this, the Japanese began letting it be known in their telecommunications that we could read that they were suspecting that we had cracked their code. We did not want them to radically change it and have to start from scratch again, right? So in order to just set that fear aside, right, we would take these breaks, if you will, in which we would not warn our soldiers of incoming attacks when we knew through radio communication they were coming, so that it would convince the Japanese, no, they weren't ready here, they weren't ready there, they seem to have not cracked our code, so we'll go ahead and keep the same code. So yes, the goal, the result was very beneficial in the big picture, but the means by which we did it, right, we caused American soldiers to die that could have been saved had we warned them. And then as an example, one last example is Schweinfurt. At Schweinfurt, Germany, we had a new answer to the German Luftwaffe, okay, that would just easily run down our bombers, because the bombers were big and heavy and could drop the nastiest bombs, but they were slow and cumbersome and vulnerable in aerial attack. So we put our bombers up in the air just to lure the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, up so that we could use our new toy, the P-51 Mustang, against them. And it worked. Our P-51 Mustangs shot down, I don't remember how many at Schweinfurt, but it was a lot of German aircraft. But at the cost of many of the bombers who were being used as decoys getting shot down and killed. So imagine making those types of decisions in war, sacrificing your pawns for your bishops, etc. So I'm contending, right? It's a strong term, but I'm contending that sometimes, often, we used Machiavellian means to win. And Machiavellian, right, is implied that it's amoral. You're not worried about what's right or wrong morally. All you care about are the results. what yields the best practical results, even if you have to be ruthless in your methods. That's a picture of Dresden there. And number 4, right? As I contend, we did not fight the war for the right reasons. That yes, fascism was inherently dangerous to what we hold dearly in Western Civ. Yes, their imperialism across Europe and Asia posed a threat to Western civilization. But we contended, right, in something called the Atlantic Charter that we signed with England, that we were fighting World War II for the basic human rights of all peoples across the globe. All right, so you could look that up, the Atlantic Charter, and see more specific data. But I say, I don't buy it in number 4. If we're fighting for the dignity and the human rights of all people, why did we treat certain ethnic minorities here in this country so poorly if we were really fighting for that reason? So I get into segregation and discrimination of Hispanics. Okay. And then I show how ironic it was that while we were treating them terribly, they were still heroically serving our country. Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, etc. during World War II. Some of them getting high medals of honor. Then also the Zoot Suit riots, right? To this day, right, supposedly East LA is a Mexican American enclave. And it was already back then. And so some of the American sailors, they would have their time off. They would go into East LA because of the nightlife. Well, a fist fight ensued. A young Latino supposedly whistled at an Anglo-American's girlfriend. They got in a fist fight, and the Latino broke the Anglo-American's jaw. He went back to the ship. Others heard about it, and they came back for revenge. It just was started from this just micro, singular incident. It turned into a full-blown riot. And the Mexican Americans already had developed a reputation for being criminally prone in the press and unpatriotic to the country. More proud of being Mexican than American. So the Sleepy Lagoon case, there was a murderer of a young man named Jose Diaz at a party. Hank Levas and others were arrested for it, and they were wearing the famous zoot suit that was in vogue at that time. And the zoot suit became associated just as an article of clothing for quote, deviant adolescence, for which I don't know the origin of the Spanish word. That became derisively known as pachucos. By the way, it came out that one of the men arrested, his girlfriend, her younger brother, had killed Jose Diaz. Then he himself was murdered. Then after his murder, fearing no reprisal because no one could do anything to him at that point after he had died, the sister came out with evidence of her brother having killed Jose Diaz. They released Hank Levas and the other, quote, pachucos. There was no formal apology. Nothing. After they had served a couple years in jail. Right. And then of course, right, there were a couple things that just threw the country into a state of delirium with Japan. One, as they were getting involved into court martial cases on Pearl Harbor, what was it? Husband Kimmel was in charge of the naval forces there, and Walter Short was in charge of the land army forces. And they were both initially held under court martial for negligence of duty and failure to prepare for that attack adequately. Well, as they were having these deliberations, they found evidence of some Japanese Americans in Hawaii giving coordinates information to the Japanese government, basically serving as spies. All right. And the country was furious because they already felt, quote, betrayed because Japan attacked us, right, before declaring war as a surprise. So then you also had a Japanese American or a Japanese soldier who was captured in battle, and he had in his backpack a map of the U.S. With arrows and of projected routes of suggesting an invasion of the United States, and it was put all throughout the newspapers around the country. So they began to contend, right, is that the Japanese Americans, if there were an attack, an invasion of our West Coast, and by the way, that was exacerbated, the fear of that, by a 30,000 man Japanese army on the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska, threatening to invade Alaska. So at any rate, the term we used, and I'd like to look up the term. I'm sure there's an historical explanation for it, but the term is fifth, the number five, fifth column. That the Japanese Americans, should there be an invasion on the West Coast, that the Japanese Americans would likely constitute a fifth column, an enemy amongst ourselves, that would rise up and aid and assist their fellow Japanese, ethnic Japanese soldiers. And then you also had the case of the air balloons that came and exploded in Oregon and elsewhere, just a handful. But the one in Oregon, there was a teacher with her young students on a field trip, and one of the kids saw it land and thought it was a toy, and it blew up and killed the child, killed the teacher, and a handful of the other students. And the stories, spread. So at any rate, for those and perhaps more nefarious reasons that I'm unaware of, our president signed Executive Order 9066, which called for the internment or the imprisonment of Japanese immigrants and even of Japanese Americans in about 24 internment camps in the West. A good book on this is All That We Could Carry, and that was a term used in Seattle, Washington, where there was a radio announcement from the mayor saying, Japanese, you have 48 hours to evacuate your homes. If you want to sell them, you have 48 hours to do so. But other than that, you must leave within 48 hours, report to the local camp, and bring only that which you can carry. So at any rate, um, they put thousands into these camps. I have some with the notes, and I don't have them on me. I'm sorry. I could give you an exact number. Howard Zinn has an exact number. Yeah, should I want to guess? But I might be way off, so I'm not going to. But at any rate, technically, right, they were given food and shelter. There was I've never read of a case of torture. There was no execution, policy. Uh, they Most of them lived through it. However, for one, um, it was a very Spartan-like and degrading environment. Two, they were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, and if they were to rebel or try to run away, they could be shot. And there were two cases that I've read of that happened. One, I always get them mixed up. I might have it in here. It's either Tule Lake or Tulare here in California. But one of those two was known for being the camp of the quote troublemakers. Because what they did is they gave out to the young men, military age, Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants. I think it was just the Japanese Americans actually. They gave them a series of questions to answer, and basically what they were trying to gauge was their sense of loyalty to the United States, and if they'd be willing to fight for the country. Well, if they were known for being defiant in another camp, or if they gave the wrong answers on that questionnaire and proved to be, quote, disloyal, they were sent to this Tule Lake or Tulare. And they had a riot, and they shot rubber bullets at everyone in the cafeteria. And then they had another riot outside, and they shot and killed a few of them. So the number was very small. I think fewer than 10, but there were some people who died in these camps. And then a lot of them, you guys, lost their property trying to come home after the war, and they were derelict on paying their property taxes and their mortgage payments. Well, of course they were. They were stuck in camps. They were imprisoned. So later on, President Reagan and President Clinton engaged in an attempts to pay reparations to their descendants and gave a formal apology. But there was a young man here in California named Fred Korematsu, and he sued and said that on the basis of the 14th Amendment that said anyone born or naturalized here is a citizen in any and all states, and he was born here, not in Japan, he said then clearly this is a violation of my rights as an American citizen. And sadly, he lost. They decided that because it was in a time of war and a possible invasion by Japan, that under military times and circumstances, the military had a right to temporarily basically imprison him and other Japanese Americans. And then lastly, real briefly, the young ladies you see there at the bottom, there was an interesting book called Abiding Courage about African American women who came in large numbers all the way from the Deep South to Oakland and Richmond, California, to get paid well as riveters, welders, etc., building the war effort, building the war machine, and getting paid very well. But the problem is, right, is that the country didn't thank them for it. They saw them as stealing good paying jobs. And the local communities there in Richmond and Oakland, etc., they experienced white flight. of white communities just fleeing from them, and discrimination. Some restaurants refusing them service, some apartment complexes refusing to rent to them, etc. And that bottom right, as you guess, that is those are sailors. Some came all the way from Las Vegas, you guys, down into East LA to look for Pachucos to try to beat them up during the Zoot Suit riots. And that's Hank Levas and the other, quote, Pachucos, who were convicted of the murder of Jose Diaz, from which, of course, later on it seems as if they were positively innocent. So look at the cynical term I leave this assignment with. We were a lesser evil at best. That we may have been fighting against a real threat to humanity, but we were simply a lesser evil. Okay, so pretty cynical revisionist take, but you might agree that it's true. All right, so please be sure that you read all of them. All right, and I will let you go if that's okay. Anybody have any last minute questions? Thank you. Thank you, everybody. You guys have a good day.
Thank you. Have a nice rest of your evening.
You as well. Thank you, Marisol.
Thank you. You too.
Bye, Kaylin. Bye, everyone.